My name is Lyndsay and I am co-chair of McMillan LLP's Privacy and Data Protection Group and its Cybersecurity Group. McMillan is a Canadian law firm, a business law firm, and we assist employers and businesses of all types with any type of Canadian legal issues that may arise. My practice would be on advising on all areas of privacy and data security law. GDPR is European legislation that will govern all processing of personal data in the European Union. It's intended to standardize the privacy and data protection laws across EU countries. So to understand the application of the legislation, it's important to understand that personal data is basically any information about an identified or identifiable natural person. So information about people as opposed to businesses. In particular, if a person is directly or indirectly identifiable by reference to something such as a name or ID number, or even things like location information or personal characteristics such as physical features. And processing means basically anything that you do with data about natural persons. So whether that's done by a person or by automated means, including any collection, use, storage, access, disclosure, or destruction of the information. And the GDPR contains very detailed rules and restrictions applicable to the processing of personal data, including rules around when processing is permitted, and also the rights of the data subjects, who are the people that the information is about. So digital marketers in Canada should be aware that the GDPR will apply to their activities even if they do not have physical premises in the European Union in two circumstances. Firstly, if they offer any goods or services to data subjects in the EU, regardless of whether the data subjects are required to pay for those goods or services. So this would apply to offering a free newsletter to EU data subjects. And it will also apply to any monitoring of the behavior of EU data subjects. So this would include online tracking of user activities or preferences. So all digital marketers, regardless of where they're located, have to assess what information they're processing about EU data subjects in order to determine if they fit into either of these two categories. And then if they do, they'll need to turn their minds to the requirements of the GDPR and whether they have appropriate policies and processes in place to comply with them. It's important to understand that the penalties for non-compliance can be massive, up to 4% of annual worldwide turnover for the entire corporate group for some types of offenses. The first thing that digital marketers should do is determine the legal basis for their processing of personal data. So there are a number of different options available under the legislation. For example, personal data can be processed for what's known as legitimate business interests. Marketers who are relying upon this basis for processing information should document the relevant business interests and also evaluate what data they're collecting to ensure they're not collecting more information than they need to accomplish their legitimate business purposes. Alternatively, personal data can be processed with the consent of the data subjects. In fact, explicit consent is needed for certain categories of sensitive data, including information on racial or ethnic origin, political opinions, religious beliefs, health information, or sexual orientation. But digital marketers that are relying upon consent will have to evaluate their consent language and their process for collecting consent to ensure that it complies with the GDPR. So, for example, under the GDPR, consent has to be freely given, specific, informed, and unambiguous, and it must be shown by a statement or clear affirmative action. This means that marketers should have explicit opt-in consent, for example, to receive the newsletters. They should not be relying on implied consent or pre-checked boxes. Also, at the time of the sign-up, they'll have to provide a notice to the data subjects that clearly sets out who will be processing the data and how it will be used and shared. The consent also cannot be bundled with other things because the GDPR provides that consent has to be specific to each data processing operation. So if they want to sign people up for newsletters and also do something else, such as send them advertisements, they'll have to have separate consents potentially for those. and they can't make their services conditional upon the data subject providing consent to processing beyond what's needed. For example, if someone wants to sign up for a newsletter, you can't say you can only get our newsletter if you also consent to us doing A, B, and C, which are unrelated to the newsletter. At the time of getting consent, you have to let individuals know that they have the right to withdraw their consent, and also the process for doing this has to be as easy as it was to provide the consent. So that's the first thing. The second thing that digital marketers should do is to evaluate whether they have appropriate processes in place for data subjects to exercise their rights. So this would include the right to access their personal information, to have their personal information erased, and the right to data portability, which means that they have the right to require that their personal information be transferred to a third party. So companies have to have the internal infrastructure in place to respond appropriately to data subjects who make these types of requests. And then thirdly, digital marketers should evaluate the sufficiency of the controls they have in place to protect personal data and to detect any breaches. This would include technological controls and organizational controls within the company, such as limiting access to personal data to persons who need to know the information to perform their duties. But it would also include controls to protect personal data that service providers are processing on behalf of the company. So the GDPR actually puts primary responsibility for protecting personal data on the data controller. So that's the company that's collecting and using the information. But it contains a number of provisions that apply to things like selecting a data processor and terms that should be included in contracts with data processors. So if you have a service provider who's processing some of the data on your company's behalf, you'll have to keep those requirements in mind. And also, it's important to keep in mind that the GDPR will contain mandatory breach reporting requirements. Personal data breaches must generally be reported to the relevant regulator, typically within 72 hours, unless the breach is unlikely to result in risk to the rights and freedoms of the data subjects. So digital marketers who are required to comply with the GDPR will need to ensure that they have a breach response plan that will allow them to react very quickly to any data breach, including if their data processor is the one that experienced the breach. Phone number is 416-865-7083, or you can reach me at lyndsay.wasser@mcmillan.ca.